On May 23, 1568, John de Ligne, the landowner of the North Hollands, was pursuing a rebel army out of his northern province. Spanish reinforcements led by Alva, the governor of Holland, were initially outnumbered. John's army was advancing north around the small village of Heiligerlee. John's army encountered a small cavalry unit led by Louisville. He decided to pursue the rebels, expecting an easy victory. What he didn't know was that he was following them directly into an ambush. The ambush is widely considered the starting point of the 80-year Dutch War of Independence. At the heart of the early stages of the Dutch War of Independence was one man, William the Silent of Orange. Born in 1533, he became the richest and most prominent representative of the Dutch nobility of his time, inheriting lands in France and the Highlands. He joined the inner circle of the ruling monarchs of Europe since the early reign of the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain. Charles V ensured that William received a Catholic education in Brussels, and a close relationship developed between the Emperor and the young prince in October 1555. Charles V abdicated in favour of his son, Philip II, who became ruler of the 17 provinces of the Habsburg Dutch lands. A year later, Philip acquired his father's Spanish lands, but he inherited empty coffers, and due to the ongoing war with France, his funds were quickly depleted. But he also inherited a perhaps more serious problem. Philip was a staunch Catholic and made it clear that he would continue the persecution of heretics, a practice begun by his father. However, the United Provinces had already embraced the Reformation and were less than enthusiastic about their Spanish ruler, condemning their religious choice and imposing Catholicism on them. Philip was described as a skeptic who spoke neither French nor Dutch, which strained his relations with the Council of State and the Consultative Assembly upon his return to Spain. After his coronation as king in 1559, a collective sigh of relief was heard from the provinces. Philip never set foot in the north again. He left his sister, Margaret of Parma, as governor of the Netherlands, with Brussels divided. William, like his father, served Philip faithfully. Upon his departure, Philip appointed William governor of the provinces of Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht. However, Antoine Perrinot de Conville held considerable influence in Brussels. He had direct contact with Margaret and zealously implemented Philip's strict anti-Calvinist orders throughout the country. As Calvinism spread throughout the region immediately after Philip's departure for Spain, tensions arose between Granville and the Dutch nobility, while Granville zealously followed Philip's hardline line. William deviated from this line in 1561, marrying the Lutheran Anna of Saxony, further inflaming Spanish tensions. Suspicions were exacerbated when his marriage strengthened his ties with the German lords, who opposed Philip's rule after numerous complaints from prominent Dutch nobles, including Margaret, who questioned his sincerity. Philip, who was extremely harsh toward Grenville, was recalled to Spain. However, he continued the same hardline policies that had led to the confrontation between Grenville and the Dutch nobles. Most notable was a speech William gave in 1564, in which he strongly advocated religious pluralism. Despite attempts by William and other nobles to persuade Philip to agree to interfaith coexistence, the king made it clear that he would continue his vicious persecution of heretics, which only exacerbated the situation. By the end of 1565, the minor Dutch nobles had joined the Union. They were extremists and didn't hesitate to use violence, but William persuaded him to submit a petition instead. Over 300 minor nobles presented a moderate petition to Margaret, asking the king to stop the persecution of heretics. When a second petition was presented to Margaret, she agreed to stop religious persecution even before Philip's final judgment. This was followed by the liberation of 40 years of pent-up oppression. Throughout the summer, Calvinist preachers took to the streets, and public sermons were given on every corner. Although the demonstrations were initially peaceful, the mobs soon turned against Catholic institutions. What followed became known as the Belden Storm, as Catholic churches revolted and were vandalized. The unrest began in the south, but spread to the north. It was a summer of chaos. Margaret sent the army to hang anyone who dared. William also condemned these actions and even ordered the execution of several troublemakers. But in the aftermath, any agreement seemed more distant than ever, even after all this. William hesitated to lead a rebellion against Philip. For example, in March 1567, when the rebels attacked the Flemish army near Antwerp, William ordered that no aid be provided to the king. But when Margaret demanded that all the leading Dutch nobles swear an oath of allegiance, William was one of the few to refuse, instead moving to his family's castle at Dillenburg, which later became the main centre. Finally, after the buildings were stormed, Philip organized resistance, appointing the notorious Iron Duke Fernando Alvarez de Toledo as governor of the Netherlands to restore order. He arrived in August 1567, backed by a large Spanish army. One of his first decisions was to establish a new tribunal to deal with heretics among the Dutch. This tribunal became known as the Council of Blood. No one was safe. Even the leading nobles were arrested and their property confiscated. William II's property was confiscated, and many fled to his side. The country was either under French occupation or under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire. Over time, many urged William to revolt. Eventually, he was convinced and sold furniture, paintings, and jewelry to raise an army to invade the Netherlands from the east. After long negotiations and careful planning, William devised the plan. William would lead an army to Budapest in the east. Count Hox of Strata was to invade the country via the Upper Helleraa, and William's brothers, Louis and Adolf of Nassau, participated in the invasion of Clun in the north. The first army to invade was a group of mercenaries. Count Hosgater was in poor health, so they had another commander. After a full-scale siege of Warmont, the army retreated to Dalhang, where it rested in the early hours of the morning. A fleeing force sent by Alva surprised the army. The rebels were killed and they suffered heavy losses. This defeat was a setback. A few weeks later, the rebels had a chance to prove their innocence in May. The army invaded the province of Groningen. The rebel army was in poor condition because Louis and Adolf of Nassau had not paid them on time. Most of his army was made up of German mercenaries, while most of the cavalry was made up of German and Dutch loyalists, despite their poor pay. Louis managed to rally them one last time, and they captured Envoyde Castle and marched on the city of Groningen, despite their small number of troops. Louis realized that a siege was unrealistic, but he nevertheless surrounded the northern and eastern sides of the city. He managed to maintain this siege for 6 weeks before leaving, aware that Army Alpha was undoubtedly approaching to liberate the city and drive out the rebels. They retreated towards East Frisia. However, the provincial depot intercepted part of their army around the small town of Heiligerlee. Although they withdrew, their army remained largely intact. Louis commanded 3,900 infantry, and his brother Adolf commanded 200 cavalry. They set up camp near Hille Abbey. The shareholder, Joan de Leyne, Duke of Ehrenberg, had approximately 3,200 infantry and 200 cavalry at his disposal, but the majority of his infantry were Polish mercenaries, Realizing the small size of his army, he advanced toward the invading army, requesting reinforcements, even though Alvaro's reinforcements had yet to arrive. He was confident in his ability to pursue the rebels and drive them out of the province. They had failed in the siege of Groningen, and their morale was certainly low. When he received news of the rebel army near Heiligerlee Abbey, he decided to launch an attack, moving his forces toward Heiligerlee. Heiligerlee Abbey was located on a hilltop between two other monasteries. A road connected the monastery to the neighbouring village, and the area was marshy, causing the locals to breathe in the heat. Numerous holes in the ground obscured the army's view as it advanced. He was unable to exploit a surprise attack because Adolf and Louis realized they were being pursued. On May 23rd, near Hille, Adolf launched a small cavalry attack against the storekeeper's army. The two forces engaged in a skirmish. Adolf had a false numerical advantage, and this appeared to be a last, desperate attempt to save his retreating infantry. Slowly but surely he was pushed further and further towards the monastery. His knights entered the swamp between the other two hills. Surely Adolf's knights were doomed. As the warehouse keeper and his army approached, they suddenly heard shouting. It was a trick. Adolf had managed to lure the warehouse keeper's army. Suddenly infantry appeared from behind the surrounding heights and craters in the ground. The warehouse keeper was trapped. The rebels now rushed towards his governor. The infantry fought fiercely, while the rebel knights rushed back to the disoriented statue. During the ensuing skirmish, the census-taker was killed. Shortly afterward, his army was completely routed as the rebels pursued them across the road. However, either during the skirmish or while luring them away, Adolf was struck by a sword and died of his wounds. All the Polish mercenaries fled, but they did not pursue them for fear of a large relief force approaching. Instead, they regrouped and continued their march toward East Frisia. The total number of casualties on the Spanish side is estimated at between 450 and 800 soldiers. The rebels lost around 50. Although Adolf was killed, it was a resounding victory for the rebels, and their morale was boosted by the news of the rebel victory at Heilig. The soldiers responded in the manner expected of an Iron Duke. 2 prominent nobles were beheaded in the Brussels marketplace, and afterward the Spanish publicly executed several minor nobles and arrested heretics. As for the rebels, the Highlanders' victory at Heil gave them no incentive to continue their advance. Victories. 2 months after the battle, the brothers were soundly defeated at Yamgum. William's invasion also failed. Subsequent military campaigns were disastrous, and William was nearly bankrupt. By the end of the year, he had lost his brother and his possessions in a raid. He returned to his castle at Dillenburg. Many historians consider the Battle of Heiligerlee the beginning of the 80 Years' War, despite the numerous skirmishes and sieges that preceded it. It is certain that another 80 years of war followed, with a brief interim period. These battles, military campaigns and sieges marked the beginning of the Dutch War of Independence, which led to the establishment of the Dutch Republic as we know it today.